Good afternoon, students. Today is Wednesday, 15 September 2021. This is the next to last video that I'll be posting for you this semester. I know it's been frustrating, but we're scheduled to go back into the classroom on Tuesday, which is 6 days from now. So there'll be one more videotaped lecture after today. And I told you by my email the other day that it'll probably be Friday, 2 days from now. So today's Wednesday. In 2 days, I will post my final video. And then next Tuesday, we'll go back into the classroom. So before we get back to the essay by J.L. Mackie, I have a few things I'd like to discuss with you. First of all, the first exam is coming up pretty quickly. The first exam is on the 28th of September. It will be administered on Canvas. I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we get closer, but it's now only 13 days away. 1 week before the exam, which is the 21st of September, I will post on Canvas what I call a sampling of examination questions. And the purpose of that is to show you the kind of questions that you'll see on the exam, so you won't be frightened, or that you won't feel too much anxiety. Okay, so Tuesday, which happens to be the first day we go back into the classroom, probably sometime that afternoon, I will post on Canvas these sample questions for you. And I'm going to do that only one time this semester. By the time the second exam comes around, you will by then know what my exams are like. What else? I will not be recording videos starting on Tuesday. So you need to be in the classroom. If you happen to miss a day of class, you'll have to get notes from another student. That's the way it's always been. So if the university is going to send us back into the classroom with full classes, I'm going to go back to doing things the old-fashioned way. So I really expect that the video on Friday will be the final video that I do this entire semester. Now, things could change. If the COVID pandemic gets worse, UTA may decide to go back to online courses or perhaps hybrid courses. And I'm going to, if that happens, I'll decide then what we're going to do. But starting Tuesday, we're going to be back to normal. So I expect you to be in the classroom listening to my live lectures. Okay, I have a number of postings. In fact, I printed out my most recent list, not counting the videos that I have posted for you. There have been 26 postings on Canvas already. Only 3 of them, the latest 3, have to do with the article that we'll be taking up on Friday, which is an article by William Rowe. And I've posted 3 items already for that. The first item is the essay itself. So, before you watch my video on Friday, make sure you've read part 1, at least, of Rowe's essay. And I'll remind you of that in my video, at the beginning of my video on Friday. I'll probably say, turn the video off, go back and read part 1 of the essay, and then come back and watch the video. The second item is optional reading. It's a short interview with William Rowe, in which he talks about his background and so forth. It's optional reading, but I do recommend that you read it. And the third item constitutes my lecture notes for Rowe's article. Now, I posted my lecture notes, I believe, yesterday, and after I posted them, I decided I wanted to make some changes to my own lecture notes. So the changes having been made, I have now posted the revised version of my lecture notes. So if you happened to print the previous version of my lecture notes, I think the date of it was 14 September, you may want to dispose of that and print out the final version, which is now up. And that one is dated 15 September, which is today. I've been working on it this morning. Okay, so I've revised my lecture notes. Please print out the revised version, and you can follow along with it when you watch my video on Friday. And next week, we're going to be spending both days next week on William Rowe's article. And you can follow along in the classroom when I'm lecturing. The other postings I've mentioned, except for the term paper. As you know, when we went over the syllabus, I explained that there's an optional term paper. So don't be frightened, it's optional. If you are a good writer, and if you want the challenge of writing a thesis defense essay for this course, you can comply with my requirements, turn it in on time, and that term paper will constitute 1/4 of your grade for this course. The 3 exams would then each count for 1/4. So that makes 4 quarters or 1 whole grade. If you choose not to turn in a term paper, that's fine. So it's entirely up to you. And then your 3 exams would each count for 1/3 of your grade. So I'm simply giving you an option. I've now posted on Canvas a document called Requirements for the optional term paper. So even though it's optional, it doesn't mean you can do anything you want. There's still a structure to it. There are still requirements. So read the requirements. That may help you determine whether you want to pursue this option. Okay? And the other item related to that is a short book written by one of my own professors many years ago. The title is Doing Philosophy, a Guide to the Writing of Philosophy Papers. And what I've done is I've scanned his little book, and I've the 3rd edition of his little book, published in 2005, and posted it for you. It's quite short, just less than 100 pages, maybe I think it's closer to 80. I don't have my copy here. But it's something you could read over a period of a few days. And I think it'll do you some good, not just in your philosophy courses, but in all of your courses, because some of the things that Feinberg recommends are simply good writing habits, good writing skills. So look over the requirements, decide at some point whether you would like to write an optional term paper. And I give you a list of topics in there. There are 6 topics, and you can take the affirmative or the negative position on any of the 6. So really there are 12 theses that you can choose to defend. You're going to pick one of the 12. Okay, that's enough about the postings on Canvas. What I'd like you to do for Friday, sometime before you view my video, read part 1 of the essay by William Rowe. The title of his essay is The Problem of Evil and Some Varieties of Atheism. It's a famous essay. I've taught it many times. I always enjoy it. I always learn from it. Every time I read it and teach it, I learn more. It's just an immensely interesting and perceptive article, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Okay, so let's turn to the topic for today. I'm going to hold up my copy of John Mackie's famous essay entitled Evil and Omnipotence. We covered about half of it in our most recent videotape lecture, and today I'd like to finish it. Now let me go back and review what we've done. According to Mackie, there are certain propositions that theists, and remember, theists are believers in God. They believe that there's a personal God who is all-powerful, perfectly good, all-knowing, and so on. There are other attributes besides those, but theism is the belief in a God of that sort. Mackie says that theists want to believe all of the following, but they can't, because the following propositions are logically incompatible, which means they cannot all be true. And that means at least one of them must be false. And therefore, at least one of them is false. So Mackie is posing a problem for theists. He calls it the problem of evil. Now, here are the 6 propositions that Mackie says cannot all be true, which means no rational person could believe or assert all of them. Number 1, the proposition is that there is a God. And he says that on page 200. Those are his words. There is a God. Number 2, God is omnipotent. Number 3, God is wholly good or perfectly good. Number 4, evil exists. Number 5, and this is the first of 2 quasi-logical rules. That's what Mackie calls them. The first rule tells you what the connection is between good and evil. It says, and I'm quoting Mackie now, good is opposed to evil, comma, in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. So good and evil are in conflict with one another. And if a particular thing or being is good, let this be the good one, that being will get rid of evil to whatever extent it can. Okay? And the final proposition is number 6. There are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. So this sort of unpacks what omnipotence is. Omnipotence means there's nothing that you can't do. There are no limits on your power. Omnipotent. You're powerful in all ways to the maximum extent. Now Mackie claims and tries to show that these 6 propositions are logically inconsistent, or if you will, incompatible. They cannot all be true. Now, not everybody agrees with that. I should point out to you, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga in 1974 published a book entitled God, Freedom, and Evil, and I have it, I believe, in footnote 2 of my lecture notes. You can see the information there. Plantinga, and keep in mind that Mackie's article was almost 2 decades old by the time Plantinga's book appeared. So Plantinga had lots of time to think over what Mackie had argued. And Plantinga concluded that Mackie was wrong. Mackie had said in 1955 that these 6 propositions are inconsistent with one another. Plantinga tried to show that they're consistent, which means, according to Plantinga, the 6 propositions can all be true. And that flies in the face of what Mackie had argued 2 decades earlier. Now, I'm going to leave Plantinga aside. For the sake of this discussion, we're going to assume that Mackie is correct. We're only assuming it. So if you believe in God, and if you want to believe all 6 of those propositions, and if you agree with Plantinga that you can believe all 6, that's fine. But let's assume, for the sake of going forward in our discussion, that Mackie is correct, because I want to discuss the rest of his article, where he argues that certain solutions to the problem of evil are fallacious or inadequate. He uses both of those words. Okay, so here is Mackie speaking on page 201. Mackie says, if you, and he's talking to each of you individually, if you are prepared to say that God is not wholly good, which would be to deny proposition 3, or not quite omnipotent, which it would be to deny proposition 2, or that evil does not exist, which would be to deny proposition 4, or that good is not opposed to the kind of evil that exists, which would be to deny proposition 5, or that there are limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, which would be to deny proposition 6, then the problem of evil will not arise for you. Notice what Mackie is saying there. Mackie is saying that you can solve the problem of evil simply by giving up one of the 6 propositions. You can give up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And by give up, I mean stop believing them. Stop asserting them as true. So Mackie says there are adequate solutions to the problem of evil. They're adequate because if you give up one of the 6 propositions, you have removed the inconsistency. It's not the case that all 6 can be true. So if you pick one out and say, that one is false, or I reject that one, the problem goes away for you. It's an adequate solution. The problem is many theists or believers in God don't want to give up all 6 of them. They want to continue believing that there's a God. That's number 1. They want to continue believing that God is omnipotent. That's number 2, and so forth. Now, Mackie says that in addition to adequate solutions, there are half-hearted solutions. Now, if you look at my lecture notes on page 3, I created a diagram for you to show you exactly how adequate solutions, half-hearted solutions, and fallacious solutions differ from one another. So look at the northeast quadrant of my diagram on page 3 of my lecture notes on Mackie. These, Mackie calls them half-hearted solutions. These half-hearted solutions, quote, explicitly reject but implicitly assert one of the 6 constituent propositions that we've been talking about. So think about that for a moment. Mackie says some theists claim to reject one of the propositions, but as they go on from there discussing things, they let that proposition back in. Right? They explicitly cast it out, which they think helps them solve the problem of evil. But guess what? That proposition comes back in, and they continue to believe it. They continue to assert it as true. Now, what if that were to happen? Mackie says, then the person who rejected that proposition did it in a half-hearted way. Right? Half-hearted means you didn't put your full effort into it. So you initially rejected it, but then you implicitly let it back in and continued to believe it. Mackie calls that a half-hearted solution. Now, he doesn't say too many harsh things about that. I think he would say it's just a weakness. Theists, recognizing that they cannot believe all 6 propositions, pick one, and they claim to reject it and stop believing it, but somehow it works its way back into their thinking, right? So it's kind of a half-hearted rejection or solution. Now, I want to focus for the remainder of today and for the remainder of Mackie's essay on what he calls fallacious solutions. Let's go back to page 202, because Mackie says here that, in fact, let's not go back to my page 2. Let's continue to look at the diagram on page 3, and specifically look at the southwest quadrant of the chart. Mackie says that there are fallacious solutions to the problem of evil. And you need to understand exactly what their characteristics are. According to Mackie, fallacious solutions, quote, explicitly maintain all the constituent propositions, all 6 of them, but implicitly reject at least one of them in the course of the argument that explains away the problem of evil. So don't confuse fallacious solutions with half-hearted solutions. In the half-hearted case, the person in question explicitly rejects one of the propositions and then implicitly lets it back in. In the case of a fallacious solution, the theist boldly says, I assert all 6. I believe all 6 of them. But in the course of the ensuing discussion, the theist ends up rejecting one or more of them. So notice there's a kind of symmetry. With a half-hearted solution, you reject one and then let it back in. In the case of a fallacious solution, you accept all of them and then end up implicitly rejecting one. So they're really different, aren't they? So let's look at some common fallacious solutions. And Mackie is going to find fault with all of them. He's going to explain why they are fallacious. The first one, in fact, there are 4 of them altogether. And Mackie divides his essay up and labels them. Notice part B of Mackie's essay on page 202 is entitled Fallacious Solutions. That's what we're focusing on now. And he further subdivides the essay by setting off with numerals the various fallacious solutions. So the first one appears on page 203. The second one appears on page 205. The third one appears on page 206. The fourth one appears on page 208. So I'm going to proceed through the rest of Mackie's essay, and I'm going to give you the simplified version of Mackie's criticisms. Okay? Some of it's quite technical, and that's true with everything we read in this course. Everything we read has a technical side to it. It's difficult, especially for undergraduates like you. I understand that. But my goal as your instructor is to help you understand these difficult articles that we're reading. So that's why it's so important that you watch my videos and pay attention as you do so and make notes along the way. So let's get started. The first fallacious solution Mackie describes as follows, and I'm taking this from the heading on page 203. The solution says, quote, good cannot exist without evil, unquote, or perhaps, quote, evil is necessary as a counterpart to good, unquote. So sometimes you find theists saying that. They're trying to explain why there's evil in the world, even though there's a perfectly good and all-powerful God. And what they say is, well, there has to be evil because God wants there to be good, and if there weren't any evil, there wouldn't be any good. So evil, they say, is a necessary counterpart of good. Theists say that evil, good and evil are inseparable. They can't be separated. They go together. They're interlocking. Okay, let's call that inseparable. They cannot be separated. And since God wants there to be good, and good can't be separated from evil, God allows evil. So that's a solution of the problem of evil. It's a possible solution. And according to Mackie on page 203, just to get his words out there, he says, it is sometimes suggested by the theist that evil is necessary as a counterpart to good, that if there were no evil, there could be no good either, and that this solves the problem of evil. Okay? So that's the solution, the so-called solution of the problem of evil. Mackie thinks it's fallacious. That's not an acceptable or adequate solution. In fact, it's fallacious. Here are Mackie's criticisms. And if you look on page 4 of my lecture notes, you'll see I've identified 3 different criticisms. Okay? Some of them are stronger than others, but all 3 of them are meant to be criticisms of this theistic attempt to solve the problem of evil. So let's look at them. I have quoted Mackie throughout so that we can read and discuss what he says. Here's what he says as his first criticism, and this is from page 203. Quote, it sets a limit to what God can do, saying that God cannot create good without simultaneously creating evil, or he might have said allowing evil. And this means either that God is not omnipotent, and you can see in brackets I put in there, this is me talking, anything in brackets is something Keith, added to the quotation. So let me go back. This means either that God is not omnipotent, which is to deny proposition 2, or that there are some limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, which is to deny proposition 6. So Mackie says, wait a minute, theists, I understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, but have you not noticed that in your attempt to solve the problem of evil, by claiming that good and evil are inseparable, you have either limited God's power or you've said that there are certain things that an omnipotent thing cannot do. You've either said that God is not omnipotent, or you've said that there are certain limits on what an omnipotent thing can do. So even though you claim to be accepting all 6 of the propositions, you are implicitly rejecting at least one of them. That's what Mackie calls a fallacious solution. Let's turn to Mackie's second criticism. He says on page 204 now, quote, this solution denies that evil is opposed to good in our original sense. If good and evil are counterparts, as opposed to opposites, I added that, a good thing will not, quote, eliminate evil as far as it can, unquote. And that would be to deny proposition 5 of the original 6 propositions. So what is Mackie saying here? The theist started off by saying, as proposition 5, that good and evil are opposed to one another, right? They're kind of pushing against one another. They're in conflict. And now the theist is changing his or her tune. The theist is now saying that good and evil are inseparable. They can't be separated. That's a whole different picture, isn't it? Which is it, Mackie says? Are they opposed to one another? Are they in conflict like this, separate but in conflict? Or are they inseparable? The theist started off by saying in proposition 5, they're opposed. Now, in the course of offering this solution, the theist is saying something different and incompatible, that good and evil are interlocking or inseparable. So Mackie, at a minimum, is puzzled by this. He's saying to the theist, wait a minute, this seems to go against what you said in proposition 5. You've got some explaining to do. Okay, let's look at Mackie's third criticism. And I'm going to quote him from page 205. Mackie says, if there were a requirement for evil as a counterpart to good, a minute dose of evil would presumably do. What's the problem with that? He says, but theists are not usually willing to say in all contexts that all the evil that occurs is a minute and necessary dose, unquote. Now, let me explain what Mackie is up to here. The theist is claiming that the explanation for the existence of evil in the world is that it's inseparable from good. They're connected in this inseparable way. So that if God wants to allow good, God has to either bring about some evil or allow some evil to occur. And Mackie's response is, but wait a minute, if that's the role that evil plays in this theistic world, then a little bit of evil should be enough. The purpose of evil is to contrast with good. Remember the claim the theist is making. There can't be good unless there's some evil. They're a package deal. Mackie says, okay, let me accept that for the sake of discussion. Why is there so much evil? If the only purpose of evil is to provide a contrast with good, why so much? A little bit of evil would suffice. Ontologically speaking, if God just put a little bit of evil somewhere in the universe, that would provide the necessary contrast with good, which is what the theist is saying the role of evil is, to provide a contrast with good. And clearly, Mackie would add, there's far more than a minute dose of evil in the world. In fact, the world is full of evil. We find evil at every turn of our lives. There is suffering, animal and human suffering, everywhere throughout the world, and always has been, and probably always will be. So the world is full of far more evil than is necessary to provide a simple ontological contrast with good. So Mackie thinks that the theist has made a valiant effort to solve the problem of evil with this counterpart theory. But Mackie says this solution, he doesn't think it really is a solution, this attempted solution raises more questions than it answers. It creates more problems than it solves, if you want to put it that way. Okay, so be prepared to answer some questions about that particular attempted solution. Mackie thinks it's fallacious. Now, we don't have the benefit of a reply. Theists don't just roll over and give up as soon as an atheist like Mackie makes a criticism. So there's almost always a reply. But we're going to cut it off right here. We have other solutions to look at, other attempted solutions to look at. Don't you hate when people do that? I don't know why I'm doing it. I hate it myself. But sometimes you have to indicate, if I use the word solution, what I'm saying is it may or may not be a solution. So I want to do this to put the quotation marks around the word, meaning I'm not committing myself to saying that it really is a solution. It's an attempt at a solution, but it may or may not really be a solution. So do you see what I'm saying? I don't want to leave the impression that Mackie won the debate. Mackie has made some criticisms of the theistic attempt, and the theist may or may not be able to reply to those criticisms. And the reason we have to leave it there and move on is because we have other solutions to look at in only a certain amount of time. Okay, here's the second of 4 attempted solutions. Mackie thinks this one, like the first one, is fallacious. Mackie says on page 205, as the heading of this section, quote, evil is necessary as a means to good, unquote. Now, the first thing I want to do is distinguish this solution or attempted solution from the first one. The first solution said that good and evil are connected ontologically, or perhaps epistemologically, or metaphysically. They're inseparable from one another. You can't have one without the other. The second solution says something different. It says that in order for there to be good, there has to be evil. Evil is a means to good. Evil is, as Mackie puts it, evil is necessary as a means to good. So if God wants the good, God has to allow there to be some evil. Why? Because the evil is necessary as a means to good, not as a part of good. That was the first attempted solution, but as a means to good. Now, you're familiar with means, ends reasoning. If you have some end, for example, suppose you want to get your mail. I'm thinking of that because our mail comes at about this time. So if my goal or end is to get the mail, I will adopt appropriate means to help me achieve that goal or that end. So I may put my shoes on. If it's raining, I may get an umbrella. I will open the door, walk outside, walk to the mailbox, open the door, and see whether the mail came. And if so, I will take it, close the door, go back into my house. So I have an end or goal in mind. I choose appropriate means to help me achieve that end or goal. It's familiar, it's familiar reasoning. Each of us, each of us engages in this sort of reasoning on a daily basis, usually several times each day. So what what the theist is saying is God wants there to be good in the world. That's God's end. Unfortunately for God, sometimes that end cannot be achieved without allowing or creating some evil. Since God wants the good, God has to put up with the evil. God has to allow the evil or even create the evil in order to achieve the good end that God has. Okay, so that's the solution that the theist is offering. We might call it the means ends solution. I wrote that in my lecture notes for you. Now, Mackie offers one criticism of this, so let's read it and discuss it. First, he says on page 205 the following. He says, in its simple form, this solution or attempted solution has little plausibility as a solution of the problem of evil. Why? Because it obviously implies a severe restriction of God's power. And of course, that would be to deny Proposition 2. So I put that in there in brackets. Right? Proposition 2 says God is omnipotent, all-powerful. And this solution implies a severe restriction on God's power, which conflicts with Proposition 2. Now, Mackie continues, it would be a causal law that you cannot have a certain end without a certain means. So that if God has to introduce evil as a means to good, he, meaning God, must be subject to at least some causal laws. This certainly conflicts with what a theist normally means by omnipotence, which would be to deny Proposition 6 of the original 6 propositions. So before we read the next quotation from Mackie, let's stop right there. I want to make sure you understand what he's saying. Most theists, maybe not all, but most, and maybe you're one of them if you believe in God, believe that God creates the causal laws of the world. God created them. God created the laws of nature. God could have created the world with a different set of natural laws. But God, for whatever reason, chose to create a world with certain natural laws. These are the laws that scientists help discover and understand. No one thinks that God is subject to these causal laws. God created them. How can God be subject to the very laws that God created when God could have created entirely different laws? The world could be very different from what it is in terms of its causal structure. So when a theist says that in order for God to achieve the good, God must submit to the causal laws that require that certain evils exist in order for that good to exist, that suggests that God is not omnipotent. God, according to this view, is subject to causal laws, the laws of causation. And that does seem to conflict with what most theists want to say. And that is that God creates the causal laws. How could God be, again, I'm repeating myself, but how can God be subject to the very laws that God created? All right, that creates a problem for the theist's understanding of omnipotence. Now, on pages 205 and 206, Mackie adds to this. Here's what he says. The suggestion that evil is necessary as a means to good solves the problem of evil only by denying one of its constituent propositions. And here there are two choices. They're both bad for the theist. Either the theist has to say that God is not omnipotent, which is to deny proposition 2, or the theist could choose a different strategy, that by saying that the word omnipotent means, the theist can deny that the word omnipotent means what it says. So let's read the whole thing again, because it came out in a disjointed way because I was stopping in mid-quotation. The suggestion that evil is necessary as a means to good, Mackie says, solves the problem of evil only by denying one of its constituent propositions, either that God is omnipotent or that omnipotent means what it says. And the first of those denies proposition 2. The second of those denies proposition 6. So notice, this goes back to Mackie's definition of a fallacious solution. The theist wants to believe all 6 propositions and boldly claims or asserts all 6 of them. But when the theist comes to discuss them, the theist ends up backtracking. The theist ends up rejecting one or more of the 6 propositions, either 6 or 2 in this particular example. Okay, do you understand what I'm saying now? This is Mackie's discussion of what he calls or what I call the means-ends solution. The theist says God has to allow evil in order to, as a means to good. And since God wants that good, God has to put up with evil. Mackie says, why does God have to put up with evil? Why does God have to submit to the causal laws that link evil and good? God created those laws, presumably. Isn't that what you theists want to say? Surely you do say that in other contexts. So you appear to be weakening or giving up one of the 6 propositions. You've either changed your understanding of the word omnipotence, which is to deny 6, or you've now claimed that God is not, after all, omnipotent. After all, how powerful can God be if God has to submit to the laws of nature, the causal laws that structure the universe? Okay, moving right along. There are 4 fallacious solutions discussed by Mackie. We've covered 2 of them now. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3, I call the greater goods solution. And what I mean is this. It may be that evil is part of a whole that as a whole is a very good thing. If God wants that whole thing that is good on the whole, God is going to have to allow the evil that is a part of that whole. All right? So the theist is saying that there are certain goods that are so good that God wants them to exist, even though those goods have as part of them a certain evil. So let's take a look at Mackie's criticism of this solution. Let's begin with the solution itself. Now, my notes at the bottom of page 4 involve very little quotation. So let's just read what Keith, wrote here. We might call, first of all, let's begin with what Mackie says on page 206 in the little title of this subsection. The universe, he says, is better with some evil in it than it could be if there were no evil, unquote. Now, Mackie is not asserting that. He's quoting the theist who says it. Okay? The theist says the universe is better with some evil in it than it could be if there were no evil. Now, here's me talking. We might call this the greater goods solution, for it says that second order goods, such as sympathy, heroism, and benevolence, are greater than the first order evils, such as pain, disease, danger, misery, and suffering that make them possible. According to the theist, The actual world is, quote, the best of all logically possible worlds, unquote. So let me back up a little bit before we even look at Mackie's criticisms of this attempted solution. What is the theist saying? First of all, let's begin by discussing first order goods and first order evils. Mackie lists as first order evils things like pain, disease, danger, misery, and suffering. The world would be a better place if there were none of these things in existence. Pain is an intrinsically bad thing, whether it's the pain of a human being or the pain of a non-human animal. Pain is bad. Pain is an evil. So is disease. So is danger. So is misery. So is suffering of any kind. Okay? Let's call those first order evils. What would be first order goods? First order goods would be things like happiness and pleasure, contentment, security, and various other things. So the world has first order goods in it, like happiness, and it has first order evils, like unhappiness or pain. Now, think about it for a moment. What is sympathy? What does it mean to have sympathy for someone? If I come across someone who is suffering or in pain, I may feel sympathy. I probably will feel sympathy for that person or animal. Okay? When you encounter suffering or pain or disease or illness, the natural response is to sympathize with the person experiencing that pain and that suffering. Okay? So could there be sympathy in the world if there were not pain, disease, suffering, misery, and so on? It seems not. It seems that sympathy, the concept of sympathy, logically requires that there be first order evils in the world. And the same is true for the other second order goods that I list here. Heroism, benevolence. I mean, what does it mean to be a hero? A hero is someone who risks his or her life or property or liberty or something else of great value in order to save someone who is in danger, someone who is in danger of being killed or injured. Could there be heroism without first order evils? Arguably, the answer is no. So if we want heroism, if we want sympathy, if we want benevolence, we have to allow first order evils, pain, suffering, misery, and so on. So the argument is this: God wants there to be second order goods like sympathy. Logically, there couldn't be second order goods unless there were first order evils. So if the question is, why does God allow evil? One possible answer is because God wants there to be second order goods. It's pretty nifty. It's an attempted solution of the problem of evil by the theist. Right? And it looks pretty impressive. What does Mackie say about it? Let's turn to page 5 of my lecture notes. Mackie has 3 criticisms. Here's number 1. This is from page 207. Mackie says, such qualities as benevolence or sympathy have a merely derivative value. They are not higher sorts of good, but merely means to happiness, so that it would be absurd for God to keep misery in existence in order to make possible the virtues of benevolence, heroism, etc. Now, there's a lot packed in there, and I can't unpack it all. It would take too long. But Mackie seems to flat out deny what the theist is asserting. The theist is saying that benevolence is a second order good, and you can't have it unless there actually exist first order evils. Since God wants that second order good, God has to allow the first order evils. Mackie is saying But really, is benevolence a second order good? Mackie thinks benevolence, when you think hard about it, is not a second order good. It's just a means to certain other goods. So Mackie is flat out denying what the theist asserts about benevolence. The second and third criticisms of Mackie, I think, are a little easier to grasp. Let's turn to number 2. Mackie says on page 207, it follows from this solution that God is not, in our sense, benevolent or sympathetic. He is not concerned to minimize first-order evils, but only to promote second-order goods. And this might be a disturbing conclusion for some theists, unquote. Now, let me try to explain what Mackie is saying here. And of course, this is my interpretation of what Mackie wrote. I'm relying on the same text you have in front of you. I may have more experience with these matters, so I'm in a better position to explain these things to you. Mackie seems to be saying that theists typically believe that God wants to get rid of first-order evils like pain, suffering, misery, disease, danger, death, and so on. According to this attempted solution, however, God's motive is not so much to get rid of the first-order evils as to make possible the second-order goods, benevolence, sympathy, heroism. And many theists, Mackie thinks, will be disturbed by that. He says this might be a disturbing conclusion for some theists. So imagine God looking down on the world and seeing people writhing in pain or people suffering from various illnesses or diseases or just the mental anguish and suffering of a lost loved one, let's say. Most theists want to think that God has a direct response to that first order evil. God wishes it didn't occur and will take steps to prevent it, to eliminate it, and to prevent it from occurring again. According to this solution, Mackie says, God doesn't think that at all. God says, I'm happy, or at least I'm willing to allow these first order evils because they make possible what I, God, think are even more important goods, such as heroism, sympathy, and benevolence. So Mackie is making a subtle point here. He's saying that most theists think of God as responding directly to the first order evils and wanting to get rid of them, when according to this solution, God is more or less indifferent to those first order evils and is willing to allow them in order to get this greater good of benevolence, heroism, sympathy, and the like. Let's turn to the third criticism Mackie offers because he thinks it's the fatal objection to this solution. Here's what he says, pages 207, 208. The fatal objection is this. And another way to put that is, this is the killer criticism of the theistic attempt to solve the problem of evil. Mackie says, our analysis shows clearly the possibility of the existence of a second-order evil, which contrasts with a second-order good. This would include malevolence, cruelty, callousness, and cowardice. So let's stop right there. We'll come back in a moment. Mackie is saying, yes, there are second-order goods like benevolence and sympathy and heroism. But if there are second-order goods, there must be second-order evils. What would a second-order evil be? Well, a second-order evil would be indifference to a first-order evil. Or it would even be the attempt to thwart a first-order good. What if someone went around and whenever he or she saw someone who was happy or having a pleasant experience, that person thwarted it, and ended it somehow. What if I went around and every time I saw someone eating an ice cream cone, I knocked it out of the person's hand? It's like that television commercial where a former basketball player goes around and he's knocking, I think, is it cereal or something, out of people's hands in a grocery store. Well, imagine someone going around when people are eating ice cream, presumably they're deriving pleasure from it. Okay? They're in a contented state. It's pleasant. It's part of that person's happiness. Imagine someone going around knocking ice cream out of people's hands as they're eating it. What a cruel thing to do. What a callous thing to do. We would say people like that are malevolent, not benevolent, which means wishing well, but malevolent, which means wishing ill. Right? These are bad states to be in. A malevolent person is a bad person, a cruel, callous, cowardly person. These, according to Mackie, are second-order evils. So, if God allows first-order evils in order to get second-order goods like heroism, God must allow second-order evils in order to thwart or eliminate first-order goods. Right? So there can't be second-order goods unless there are second-order evils. Right? They're on a par with one another. There are first-order goods and evils down here, and then if you go up a level, you have second-order goods and evils. So let's go back and see what Mackie says. Just as a second-order good is held to be the important kind of good, the kind that God is concerned to promote, so a second-order evil will, by analogy, be the important kind of evil, the kind which God, if he were wholly good and omnipotent, would eliminate. So Mackie is saying that we could in fact keep going with this. Every time we postulate a new kind of good at a higher level, we can postulate another kind of evil at that same level. It's like a cascade, well, not a cascade, a stair step. So let me show you with my hands. Okay, this is a first order evil, first order good. No, let me start over. First order evil, first order good. God allows second order goods to thwart the first order evils. Mackie says, then there must be second order evils. And God will then and those will need to be snuffed out too. So God will create third order goods to snuff out the second order evils. And this process will keep going. In fact, it will keep going ad infinitum. There will be an infinite regress. Mackie says on page 208, this is me partly talking, an attempt to explain second order evil by postulating a third order good will lead to an infinite regress. For then there would be a third order evil, and so on ad infinitum. So this doesn't really solve the problem. The theist claims that there have to be second order goods to explain why God allows first order evils. And Mackie says, but that just generates a new kind of evil: callousness, cowardice, cruelty, malevolence. And then presumably God will create a third order good to snuff out the second order evils. But that will, if there's a third order good, then there must be a third order evil, and so on. It just keeps going, and we never reach a point where we say that's why there's evil. Okay, so Mackie thinks that this is a serious problem for the theistic attempt to solve the problem of evil, specifically the greater goods solution. All right, one more attempted solution and we'll be done. This one, according to Mackie on page 208, he says, the theist claims that evil is due to human free will. Now, I don't know why he puts that, he makes free will one word instead of two words. It doesn't matter. Evil is due to human free will. We might call this the free will solution. So let's begin. Before we look at Mackie's criticisms, let's make sure we understand what this solution really says. I'll quote Mackie from page 208. Mackie says, perhaps the most important proposed solution of the problem of evil is that evil is not to be ascribed to God at all, but to the independent actions of human beings like you and me, supposed to have been endowed by God with freedom of the will, unquote. Now, you've probably thought of this yourself or heard this solution discussed. Many people say the reason there's evil in the world is because human beings who were created by God and given the choice to do either good or evil sometimes choose evil. And once God creates freely choosing beings, God can no longer control them. And the evil that humans then do is ascribable to them, not to God. God created a certain sort of world, a very good world. God created a world not of robots who always mindlessly do good and never do evil. God created a world of responsible, free agents like you and me, who are free to do either good or evil. And of course, God hopes that we always choose good. That's part of God's plan. Right? It would be heaven on earth if we human beings always used our free will to choose the good and to do good and never chose evil or did evil. That would be heaven on earth. Unfortunately, the humans God chose to create, sometimes abuse their free will. They don't just use it, they abuse it. And they make bad choices. And when they do, the theist says, we are not to blame God for it. God gave humans the freedom to choose, and humans chose badly. And that's not God's fault. Now, Mackie is going to go on and ask, why couldn't God create humans who always choose good? And we'll talk about that in just a moment, but I thought it might be occurring to you. And I want you to know we will come back to it in a moment. So let's continue. Here's the second thing Mackie says about this attempted solution. He says on page 208, and I'm reading from my lecture notes on page 5, to explain why a holy, good God gave men and women, of course, free will, although it would lead to some important evils, it must be argued that it is better on the whole that men should act freely and sometimes err than that they should be innocent automata, acting rightly in a wholly determined way. So the theist is saying the following. Listen carefully. God created the world and everything in it, and God had lots of options. But God's hands were tied in a certain way. God could have created a world where there were no free beings, no free will, no free agents, and the beings God created always chose the good. In fact, think of God as programming them, winding them up so that they went through life always choosing and doing good and never choosing or doing evil. God could have created that sort of world. And you'd have to say this about that world. What a wonderful world. There would be no evil in it. No human-caused evil. Right? God created humans who were capable only of doing good. Therefore, the world would contain no evil. So that's one thing God could have done over here. The other thing God could have done is to create the world as we know it. Human beings have free will, and that means they're capable of choosing either good or evil, and unfortunately, sometimes they choose evil. And God, of course, knew this. When God created them with free will and gave them free will, God, of course, being omniscient, knew that they would that they could and probably would sometimes abuse that free will and do evil. So the theist says there really were just those two choices for God. There's no third choice, like creating freely willing humans who always choose good and never choose evil. That's not a possibility. Only these two possibilities that I discussed a moment ago. Now, as between those two possibilities, which is preferable from God's point of view? And therefore, which one would God actually create? Which world would God create? Well, a world with automata or automatons, robots. Do you like that little robot thing I do? A world full of robots who always do good would have something to be said for it, because, as I said a moment ago, there's no evil in that world. But is there any value in a robot doing good and only good? Maybe not. Where's the moral value in that? You've just been programmed. It's as though I created a machine that always did things that benefit others and never did anything that harmed others. Okay, where's the benefit in that machine? That machine is just following the program that I wrote for it. The other world has moral value, according to the theist. A world in which human beings are free, the world in which human beings have free will, the freedom to choose good or evil, is a morally valuable world. The beings in that world are deeply responsible, not only for their own well-being, but for the well-being of others. And from God's point of view, that is a much more attractive world. Even when you add in the evil that God knows those humans will do, the good of having free agents populating the world it overwhelms or swamps the evil that humans do. That, at any rate, is what the theist is saying with this free will solution to the problem of evil. The theist is saying that evil is attributable to human beings, not to God. And the reason God created humans with that free will is because it's a better world morally with freely choosing beings in it than it would be if there were only robots. Okay, I hope you understand the attempted solution. Now, Mackie offers 3 or 4 criticisms. Let's just discuss 3. Number 1, and this may not be satisfying to you because Mackie mentions it and says, I don't have time to go any further with it. He says on page 209, I think that this solution is unsatisfactory primarily because of the incoherence of the notion of freedom of the will, but I cannot discuss this topic adequately here. Now, let me just say a couple words about that before we move on. There are different understandings of free will, of what it means to be free, of what it means for one's will to be free. Mackie holds a particular view of free will, and it's not universally shared. Mackie thinks that in order for this solution of the problem of evil to work, the theist must have a certain view of what free will is. And Mackie thinks that that view of free will is incoherent. Mackie thinks that it cannot be stated in a coherent way. And therefore, he thinks that this solution is doomed to fail. It rests upon or presupposes an understanding of free will that is ultimately incoherent or logically impossible. Okay? So I'm going to leave it there. I don't want to go any deeper into the different understandings of free will or determinism and whether free will is compatible with determinism. Although you'll see in my notes on page 6, I say a little bit more. Why don't I go ahead and say this? Mackie is what's called a compatibilist. Mackie believes that determinism and free will are compatible. They can both be true. The world can be a deterministic place, meaning every event is caused, including every human action, And Mackie thinks that human beings can still be free to choose, even in a world that's deterministic. So Mackie thinks that God could have programmed us to do only good and never any evil, and we could still be free. Mackie thinks that's possible. Mackie thinks that our behavior could be determined by God in such a way that we always choose and do good and never choose or do evil, and we're still free. The theist, however, according to Mackie, holds a different view of free will, and on that view of free will, it's incoherent. That view of free will is incoherent. So Mackie is left wondering, why did God not create humans so that they always automatically, like robots, choose the good? Okay, let's turn to Mackie's second and third criticisms. The second criticism goes like this. This is from page 209. If God has made men such that in their free choices they sometimes prefer what is good and what is evil, why could he not have made men such that they always freely choose the good? Clearly, his failure to avail himself of this possibility is inconsistent with his being both omnipotent and wholly good. So again, Mackie thinks that the theist, in making this solution, offering this solution, is rejecting implicitly either Proposition 2 or Proposition 3. Do you see what Mackie is saying? If God can create humans who sometimes choose good, why can't God create humans who always choose good? And here I think this goes back to what I said a moment ago. Mackie thinks that God could logically create humans who are both free and whose behavior is determined by God. The theist thinks that's not possible. The theist says that wouldn't be free will. The theist, in other words, is an incompatibilist. The theist thinks that determinism and free will are incompatible. They can't both exist. They can't both be true. So the theist thinks that if God determined human behavior, it couldn't and therefore wouldn't be free. So I hope you can see that the dispute here between Mackie and the theist comes down to whether free will is compatible with determinism. Mackie thinks free will is compatible with determinism, and therefore God could have created us as robots who always do good but are still free. The theist says free will and determinism are not compatible. So if God programmed us to always do good, we wouldn't be free. So that's really the nub of it in this part of the essay. Mackie and the theist have different understandings of free will and its relation to determinism. Now, here's the final criticism of Mackie. This one is stated on pages 209 and 210. If men's wills are really free, as the theist says, this must mean that even God cannot control them. That is, that God is no longer omnipotent. And that, of course, would be to deny Proposition 2 from the original list of 6. So Mackie thinks that freedom prevents God from controlling them. And that means there's something God can't do right off the bat. God is said to be omnipotent. God is said to be able to do all things. Right? Let's go back and look at Proposition 6. Proposition 6 says there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. What is the theist now saying? Oh, there is a limit. God cannot create free beings and then control them. Mackie says, wait a minute. You asserted that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do, and now you're backtracking. Right? Now you're saying, wait a minute, there is a limit on what God can do. So that's why Mackie considers this a fallacious solution. The theist asserted all 6 and then backtracks and implicitly rejects at least one of them. Okay, in my next paragraph, I make a distinction between natural and moral evils. I'm gonna let that go. I won't ask any questions about it on the exam. We'll talk more about it when we get to Richard Swinburne's book after the first exam. So, to wrap things up, because we're an hour and 15 minutes into this lecture, what is Mackie's grand conclusion in this essay? And it's a pretty short essay as philosophical essays go, but I hope you can see there's a lot packed into it. It's highly compressed, even though in terms of words, it's not that great. Mackie writes on page 212, by way of conclusion or summary. Of the proposed solutions of the problem of evil, which we have examined, none has stood up to criticism. 0. There may be other solutions which require examination, but this study, this article, strongly suggests that there's no valid solution of the problem which does not modify at least one of the constituent propositions in a way which would seriously affect the essential core of the theistic position, unquote. So Mackie's grand conclusion is that anyone who believes in God and who also believes the other 5 propositions that we've been discussing has a problem. Those 6 propositions, according to Mackie, cannot all be true. And when theists claim that they're all true, eventually, at some point, the theist is going to implicitly reject one or more of them. And Mackie tries to show that with regard to 4 attempted solutions, the theist ends up backtracking in every case. Okay? Again, a bold assertion of the 6 propositions ends up being an implicit rejection of at least one of them. So the theist, in the end, is not consistent. The theist ends up holding an inconsistent view. Theism itself is on shaky ground, according to Mackie. So Mackie's essay really set in motion a series of articles and books in which the authors took on his challenge. People like Alvin Plantinga tried to prove that the 6 propositions are logically consistent. And Mackie, having read Plantinga's book, responded to it. Mackie was not convinced by Plantinga's attempt. Mackie, I think to his dying day, agreed with what he wrote in this 1955 article. I think Mackie took to his grave the belief that theism is incoherent and that the main claims that the theist makes cannot all be true. Okay, so let's stop there. We're more than an hour and 15 minutes in. I've said all I want to say about Mackie. Of course, a lot more could be said, but we're going to stop right there. My exam questions will focus on mainly what I lectured on, but to keep you honest, there may be a question or two drawn from the essay that I did not discuss in my lectures, my videotape lecture or my lecture notes. So that's my way of holding you responsible for this essay. You're supposed to read it. I've told you that from day one. You're responsible for everything that I assign to you. So read it carefully as many times as you need, and listen to my lectures carefully as many times as you need, and go over my lecture notes, which I followed pretty closely in my videotapes. Okay, so in 2 days, which is Friday, I will post the next lecture, and it should be the final lecture that I post this semester, because on Tuesday, next week, we're going to be back in the classroom the way we ordinarily would before COVID. And that means you should read at least the first section or part of William Rowe's essay before you watch the video on Friday. And next week, the final 2 days before the exam, we will cover sections 2 and 3 of Rowe's essay. So by the time the exam comes along on the 28th of September, we will have completed both Mackie and Rowe, which means after the exam, we'll get started on the next part of the course, which is Richard Swinburne's book. And by the way, let me remind you, you need to buy a copy of that book. We're going to be reading it over a period of several class periods. We're going to read it slowly and carefully. We're going to unpack it as much as we can, and you'll be tested on it thoroughly. So you've got to get the book. It's not enough to come in and listen to my lectures. Okay? All right, I'm going to stop the video now so I can get this uploaded to YouTube and eventually posted. It'll be sometime this afternoon before that happens. So have a good day, and I'll see you one more time on video in a couple of days.